Hello, apes, and welcome to the ninth screencast in our Chapter 3 series. And we're talking about evolution, biodiversity, and population ecology. So, we've been looking at populations, and one of the things that we're going to do now is figure out how do we figure out the population growth rate. So, we're right here on our notes. This is where we had left off in the last screencast. And we're going to take into account the crude birth rate plus the immigration rate. And we're going to add those two together. And then we're going to subtract that with the crude death rate. And we're going to add the emigration rate to that. And that is going to give us that population growth rate. This will show us the net change in population size per thousand people. Remember, we were talking about per thousand within a year. So we would do that and take the numbers over a year. We always show growth rates as percent. So when we put the population growth rate number that we get from there, we're going to times that by 100 to get percent. And then we're going to compare that percentage with the different populations and the different sizes so that we can get an idea if a population is growing or declining. Now, all of this applies to whether we're talking about a human species or an ant species. It doesn't matter what the species is. We can use these same tools in order to figure out the population growth. So you've heard me mention sometimes exponential growth, and that is when a population increases, that there's no limited resources. It continues, nothing is stopping that growth. And when we see exponential growth, and we're going to see this in the next picture, that's represented by a J-shaped curve. Ideally, exponential growth cannot be sustained indefinitely. There's always going to be some kind of limiting factor that will eventually slow that, and usually it's the availability of a resource, particularly food. It could be water, it could be shelter. So we can see exponential growth happening within a small population. Because a small population, there's going to be more resources available for them. There's not going to be as much competition competing for those resources, and typically the conditions are going to be ideal within the particular area that they have. We see this happening often with introduced species because they don't have any natural predator in the area. They have a large food source available. They're not used to being in that area, and they tend to grow exponentially. So here is a look at mourning doves, and these are birds, and we can see over the years there was slow growth, but then as resources become more available to them, that growth rate has taken off, and that is that J-shaped curve. That's exponential growth. We can also look at limiting factors that I had mentioned that could affect the population. And these can be a whole range of different factors, from physical to chemical to biological. We can look at them as being the space available for where they live, the amount of food that's available, water, their potential mates that might be in the area, the shelter, is the area they live in suitable for breeding? I mean, you could find a mate, but if you don't have breeding sites, the zebra mussels take up those breeding sites. So that can have an impact. The temperature, disease, predators, all of these are potential limiting factors that can happen, that can also have a factor on the growth rate. So if we're talking about a moose population that is eaten by wolves, if we increase in the number of predators, then the number of moose are going to go down. If the number of moose increase, then that's going to provide more food, so the number of wolves are going to increase. So they can have a potential impact on the population number. And you also probably remember carrying capacity. So we did an activity, if you were in my biology class, and we'll do it again just to have fun, our numbers are a little bit limited in this class, so I'm not sure how effective it'll be, but we'll do the carrying capacity activity. And this is where we've got an area that is able to support a certain size population, and when it goes beyond that, then that area can no longer sustain those population numbers, and the numbers start to, decline. And that's what the carrying capacity is. A lot of times limiting factors come into play. There's not enough food, there's not enough water, there's not enough shelter, and that stops that exponential growth. So when we graph this, we get a logistic growth curve, and a logistic growth curve is an S-shaped curve that we're going to be seeing. So here we go. Here's the same idea with those pigeons. They've reached exponential growth. They're going really well, but the population size now, look at this. This is getting huge. And now the resources that are available, they're just not going to be able to support these birds. Or maybe there's temperature extremes or predators or parasites. If they've eaten all of their resources, then they're susceptible to disease. And now this population, couldn't say that, starts to level off. Sometimes we'll even see it jig-jag a little bit here as it goes down and then back up, and it's not a true leveling off. It has reached the carrying capacity, and we get this S-shaped curve, which this is the logistic curve that we're seeing here. So there's different types of factors that are going to influence this. Hold on 1 minute, please. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry, I had to clear my throat there. So there are some factors that can influence the population density. And we have density-dependent factors, and we have density-independent factors. And the way that I want you to remember this is density-dependent is going to be anything that is biotic. Biotic means living, that it's a parasite that depends on a host. That's living. The parasite is living, the host is living. So it's living things that depend on it. Density independent are abiotic factors. And abiotic factors, these are non-living factors. These are things that we really can't control. Hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, natural disasters, fires, landslides, that kind of thing. So here's what's going to happen. The density-dependent factors are limiting factors whose influence is affected by the population density. So increased density is going to increase the risk of predation and disease and competition. So if I go back to that moose example, moose are herbivores, so they're going to be eating the plant life. If that population goes up, they could deplete that plant life that they need to feed on. So what typically happens in that is when they deplete their source that they normally eat, then starvation will set in and they'll be susceptible to disease and the population will go down. What also happens with that is competition. They're competing for that food source. So that is going to increase. And as we talked about wolves, these wolves are going to be preying on the moose. So if you have a large number of moose, that's going to provide more food for the predators, and the predator numbers are going to increase. So what happens with density-dependent factors is we typically see a logistic growth curve. We see that exponential growth and then that leveling off because of one of those other things, predation, disease, or competition. Larger populations have stronger effects on these limiting factors, and we see that, and hopefully we'll see that when we do the little activity in class. Density independent, as I said, these are limiting factors whose influence is not affected by population density. It doesn't matter how many individuals happen to be in that population, it's going to affect that irregardless. So floods, I mean, it's greater to have a large number of organisms so that if a flood happens, maybe a few will survive. But still, it's just going to impact that entire area. It's not going to worry about what those population numbers are. Fires and landslides and hurricanes and earthquake and volcanic activity fall under that. So when we think about how accurate is this, well, we're not going to see a lot of populations and natures that match the curve exactly, but it's a pretty close representation, a pretty close model that we can use and predict off of. So here are some examples. We've got yeast cells, and this is a great example of a logistic curve. We've got exponential growth growing here, and as soon as it uses the nutrients within the culture, it starts to level off. Here's another one. Here's a mite. The population increases, but whatever eats and feeds off the mite, they're increasing too, so it's going to drop down in numbers because of that predator that's going to eat it. When it drops down in numbers, the predator is going to drop down in numbers, so they're going to be able to increase again. This would be considered a logistic growth curve, and that zigzagging motion that you would get here. The reindeer, the St. Paul reindeer, again, they're going to grow as long as the resources are available. Once they deplete their resources and they don't have enough food, competition happens and those numbers are going to drop again. And that's another example of a logistic growth curve. So they're not perfect, but they still kind of form that S-shaped curve that we were talking about. So carrying capacities can change. Environments are very complex. They're not stagnant. They're not stationary. They do change. Limiting factors can affect and change them and alter the carrying capacity. If we've got a tornado that comes through and wipes down half the forest, that's going to take some of the food and the shelter away from the organisms that depend on it. Then you're going to lose a large number. Humans are the ones that actually lower environmental resistance for themselves because we are continuing to tear down the forest, plow under the fields, and we are taking away those resources. But we also are developing technologies that can overcome limiting factors. I saw a video that I believe in New Jersey, that they are doing these farms within warehouses where they're mass growing a large number of different plants that we feed off of, that we use and we consume. And the great thing is that they're not exposed to any insects. Plant disease can be regulated and taken out. They don't need to use any insecticides or pesticides, and they are able to grow so much more in these warehouses than they are on the fields. So humans have that ability to change. We can increase the carrying capacity for humans. We know how to use immense portions of our planet resources in a sustainable way, and we have actually reduced the carrying capacity for countless other organisms because of our use. Okay, so we're going to stop here. I know we're only like 14 minutes in, but I don't want to start this and stop this because this is a little bit more detailed information. So see you in a few minutes.